What would you do if you discovered stowed away Apollo-era aerospace technology artifacts? Would guess you'd call NASA, right? However, recently made public documents showed that a Pittsburgh collector also owned more than 300 data reels and 2 NASA computers from the time of the Apollo missions. These recordings might have been connected to undiscovered knowledge about space exploration, but NASA insisted on the script's destruction. Why did they ask for this? Could it be that they're sheltering the world from understanding specific truths about space, or they may be concealing a very important secret? Join us as we explore the lost NASA Apollo tapes found in a garage that NASA demanded be destroyed. In 2015, just a few weeks before Christmas, NASA learned of an intriguing finding. 2 gigantic computers and 325 magnetic data reels from the Apollo spaceflight era, which launched the first people to the moon, were found in the basement of the home of a deceased Pennsylvania man. The over 40-year-old relics had worn out marked from NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center and Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but they were still in usable shape. No one other than perhaps their previous owner was aware of what was on them. The antiques were handed to the metal scrapper, a friend of the man, who said he wanted to do the right thing and return them to the agency. Pioneer 8 and Pioneer 9 were 2 space weather missions that sent satellites into solar orbit as early as the middle of the 1960s. The Helios A probe traveled 46.5 million kilometers from the Sun, which at the time was a record-breaking perihelion distance. Other recordings made mention of the more well-known Pioneer 10 and Pioneer 11 probes, which were in charge of providing us with the first in-depth pictures of Jupiter and Saturn in the 1970s. Strangely, according to one report, some former NASA researchers think the latter is missing data that hasn't yet been found. For the next 5 months, staff at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, worked for the following 5 months to try and extract information from the data reels. A NASA Officer of Inspector General OIG report received through a Freedom of Information Act request was the first source through which Motherboard first learned about the probe. Ars Technica also reported on these identical papers. In the OIG report, the final owner of the recording's name has been redacted. Goddard archivists searched for valuable clues while discussing with scientists whether any missions had data gaps. For instance, NASA admitted in 2006 that it probably recycled 45 tapes with the original video of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin's illustrious July 20, 1969 moonwalk. The Apollo 11 recording gaffe still haunts NASA to this day. I should add that I keep using Apollo as an example of what we would deem historically significant only because of the Apollo tape loss issue a few years ago, wrote a Goddard employee whose name was redacted to colleagues in April 2016, also noting they were unable to find any labels that indicated Apollo content. Uncertainty exists over the authenticity of the data on the cassettes. Copies were frequently generated for backup purposes or to extract data and use the findings. According to Larry Kellogg, a former NASA systems engineer who worked with Pioneer 10 and Pioneer 11 equipment, if you only have one tape of the data and it's destroyed by a tape drive, demagnetized by a buffer, or has coffee spilled on it, you have no data. For this reason, it is common to make some backup copies. A total of 215 reels were left unlabeled, and given that labels were frequently removed before tapes were scratched or used again, NASA thinks they might be blank. At the time, magnetic tape was an expensive recording medium, and NASA frequently overwrote reels to save money. However, according to Keith Cowing, a former NASA space biologist and editor at NASA Watch, the labeled reels may have been copies of copies of copies. I'll wager that they aren't original with this many tapes, but it's irrelevant, he continued. Someone has a collection of these missions' data, I heard. The investigation's many specifics are still hazy, and due to privacy exemptions, the identities of all parties involved, including the collector, have been redacted. However, Motherboard did confirm that the tapes were later destroyed. All magnetic data tape reels were picked up by the agency recycler Unicor on the 9th of February 2016, according to NASA Goddard's Supply and Equipment Management Branch Office. GSFC received a certificate of destruction from the Unicor processing facility, signed and dated the 9th of June 2016, it added. According to the agency, NASA's procedural requirements, which lay out procedures for the identification and disposition of prospective artifacts, governed their disposal. One NASA archivist who looked at the artifacts said that salvaging their data would have been extremely expensive. Even then, it was still possible that nothing could be salvaged from the reels because they were so seriously moldy. The man's Pittsburgh home was where the NASA rejected computers were left. Someone close to the collector told the metal recycler, "Please convince NASA these objects weren't stolen," claiming that a nearby IBM site had donated them to him. NASA takes records retention matters very seriously, so upon receiving notice about these former NASA assets, NASA undertook a new inspection in 2015 to 2016, NASA spokesperson said anyway. NASA determined that the magnetic tapes were in all likelihood erased prior to their original disposition, they added. In addition, the tapes were suffering from extensive mold contamination. Weighing these factors, the agency determined the magnetic tapes were of no intrinsic or informational value to the agency. However, if the tape's dates, which range from 1961 to 1974, are true, they fall into a period when hundreds of data reels were lost, abandoned, or used for other purposes in NASA's past. As a result, several of NASA's earlier missions had missing data. The U.S. General Accounting Office, GAO, once criticized the agency in a 1990 report to the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology for failing to archive potentially significant data, according to the report. At Goddard's National Space Science Data Center, NSSDC, the agency's permanent archive for space science mission data, NASA estimated that 30 to 59% of mission data for each of the Pioneer 10 and Pioneer 11 missions had been archived. The NSSDC rated this level of archival effort as good. According to the GAO report, one NASA data user authorized the destruction of every other carton of tapes in order to preserve some of the tapes that he had released thousands of tapes because he could not afford continued storage and was reluctant to raise the retention issue all the way up to the Goddard director. When explaining why so much data had not been kept at the time, NASA highlighted a lack of written agreements between itself and researchers, as well as lax procedures for the archiving of specific data. Since that time, the organization has partnered with the National Archives and Records Administration to implement a new records management system that strictly restricts what data can be deleted. The missing data from the Pioneer 10 Jupiter encounter, the mission that provided us with the first ever photos of the gas giant and its moons, delivered by the probe on December 4, 1973, could be one potential, if speculative, match. Pioneer 10 and Pioneer 11 were observed by NASA to be slowing down and deviating from their expected trajectories in interstellar space in 1980. This phenomenon, now known as the Pioneer anomaly, has been attributed to thermal forces pushing the spacecraft backward. Years later, Kellogg gave Pioneer MDRs to a group of researchers who wanted to look into the anomaly. Kellogg had copied the files onto a modern computer. However, a review of all the files revealed that 9 days' worth of Pioneer 10 MDRs from 1973 were missing. Data from these days were never transcribed from original MDRs to optical CDs, according to NASA transcription records. Maybe someone wanted to see if they could get the data used for making the image of Jupiter and generate an image using newer software, Kellogg reckoned. We couldn't confirm that. You just have those flashes of memories of something that might have been said several years back, and you are not sure it wasn't a dream. NASA did not include the lost Pioneer 10 tapes in its study, but it did highlight the heroic endeavor to find the anomaly's data. When asked if NASA took these missing recordings into account when conducting its audit, a NASA spokeswoman merely remarked, "Pioneer was discussed in detail." That someone was able to accumulate so much NASA memorabilia is the least intriguing aspect of this tale. NASA routinely held auctions for excess assets during the 1970s and 1980s. There was not enough space, funds ran out, or the technology grew outdated. Some of the pieces are still there today in private collections, while others have become junk. In other instances, workers and subcontractors stole items that would have been thrown away. This was notably infamous during the Apollo era. In July 1969, when Neil Armstrong got ready to take his one small step onto the moon, a reinforced video camera hidden within the lander's door turned on to record the historic moment. The eerie photos of the astronaut's boot striking the ground capture what may be the most famous moment in NASA history, as well as a significant turning point for humanity. Those hazy, shifting images were seen by millions of television viewers all across the world who were astounded and even entranced. They were unaware that the camera on Apollo 11 had actually returned dramatic and clearer video, spectacular images that, amazingly, very few people have ever seen. And although the televised photographs had rather poor visual quality, the landing was such a success, and NASA engineers who did examine them realized what the general audience was missing. The original, excellent moon tapes were quickly stored and lost. Only recently was the agency made aware of the value of its archive of clear, sharp, first man-on-the-moon video footage, which may be especially important now that NASA is considering a return mission. NASA was suddenly eager to have the tapes about 36 years after they were placed in storage. The tapes were nowhere to be located though, which wasn't the only issue. What began as a casual inquiry evolved into a formal search of NASA site's archives, record centers, and storage areas. Disappointed officials now say that the track they followed has vanished after many months. Despite their continued efforts, they admit that it's possible the videos are irretrievably lost. The hunt also includes Stanley Labar, who is in charge of creating the lunar camera. He can list all the reasonable explanations for why he and his colleagues did not give the tapes the attention they required in 1969. They were inconvenient and in a highly specialized format that seemed to have little value in the pre-digital era, but now he is kicking himself for not obtaining a copy for safekeeping. Due to television footage from the later Apollo missions being much better, the story of the missing Apollo 11 tapes is made all the more embarrassing. An interestingly constructed video feed was only utilized for Apollo 11. From the moon, it was relayed to ground stations in Australia and the Mojave Desert in California, where workers reformatted the film for broadcast and sent it over analog lines long distance to Houston. During that process, a significant amount of video quality was lost, turning sharp, clear images into gray blobs and strangely moving forms, or what Labar now refers to as a bastardized version of the genuine material. Since nearly the whole broadcast spectrum was required to convey flight data to Earth, the first video from the moon was in an unusual slow scan format. The format used a significantly lower radio frequency than usual and scanned only 30% of the typical frames per second. If not for the initiative of a retired California ground station engineer and several Australian technicians who get together for reunions on a regular basis, the photographs would have likely been forgotten and of little significance to Labar, Navska, and NASA. A 14-inch reel tape that appeared to be from that period was discovered in a man's garage in 2002 who had previously worked at Australia's Honeysuckle Creek ground station in 1969 and had seen the high-quality Apollo 11 video originals at the time. He brought it to a reunion of Honeysuckle Creek and distributed it. More Honeysuckle veterans attended the reunion the next year, and this time they brought souvenirs from the Apollo era that included actual moonwalk images that they had shot while watching the footage on their specialized monitors. The images in the photos were of the originals, not the remastered versions used for television, and it was obvious that they were much better than what everyone else had seen. Similar photographs were taken at the Mojave site from an American engineer. Although they lacked a device to play the awkward reels, the Australians were keen to find out if the tape indeed captured the Apollo 11 moonwalk. They located Navska 66, one of the few persons from the Apollo 11 era still employed at the Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, where the majority of the Apollo data had been handled, after becoming convinced that the recordings might be of historical and educational importance. The good fortune continued when Navska learned that one of the few 7-foot-tall analog devices that could play the Apollo video was still present in the data evaluation lab at Goddard, which was soon to be closed down. He eagerly loaded the tapes that the Australians had sent him into the recorder, but all that was shown was computer data and conversation from an earlier Apollo mission. Although it was discouraging, the seed had been planted. NASA not only possessed a piece of equipment that could play the initial moonwalk tapes in its possession, it also had two men, Navska and Labar, who were ready to put in countless hours of their own time to seek for the 3 hours of tape and still lived close to Goddard. They searched for weeks in the huge Suitland National Record Center where the tapes had previously been kept. They were unsuccessful until they discovered documents indicating that between the early 1970s and the early 1980s, Goddard officials had sought over 26,000 cartons of Apollo cassettes. The chances of locating the 45 videotapes from Apollo 11 were obviously slim, given that they would have been kept in just 9 of those crates. But Navska and Labar were upbeat despite this. However, they were unable to locate either the missing tapes or anyone with significant knowledge of them at Goddard. Navska and Labar haven't had much luck figuring out who it might have been at Goddard who sent the Apollo tapes to alternate storage, scattered them to other NASA locations, or had them destroyed. The task was made more challenging by the fact that everything occurred more than 30 years ago because some of the most likely decision makers are already deceased. Now that the tapes are missing, NASA is rather embarrassed. Let us know what you think in the comments section below.